And now, a passage from Stories of Old New Haven, from Chapter 6, How New Haven Hid the Judges Who Condemned a King to Death. There is no story of Old New Haven that is more interesting or so full of strange and exciting adventures as the story of the Regicides, Edward Whaley, William Goff, and John Dixwell. These men were brave fighters in Oliver Cromwell's Puritan army, and when it was determined to try King Charles I of England for treason, they were made judges of the famous court which condemned him to death. That was in 1649. 11 years had gone by since that terrible event. Cromwell was dead, and Charles II, King of England. All the enemies of the old king had been pardoned, except the judges who had caused him to be beheaded. The new king wanted revenge for the death of his father, and demanded that these judges be punished. Some of them were seized and executed, but others ran away and hid. Whaley and Goff knew what was in store for them and sailed away to New England before the new king was crowned. They landed at Boston in July 1660. They were received with great honor and treated with much kindness by Governor Endicott and the people of Massachusetts, for they had done brave deeds for the Puritan cause in England. After a short stay in Boston, they went to Cambridge, where they lived very quietly, although they did not try to hide. It was not then known in Boston that the new king wanted to have them arrested and punished. There is a good story told of these two regicides in connection with their stay in Massachusetts, a story which shows that they were very skillful with their swords and knew how to humble a silly boaster as well. A stranger came along one day and set up a little platform in the street. Mounting it, he flourished a sword and dared anyone to fight with him. No one seemed willing to try it. Finally, one of the regicides, dressed as a rough farmer, wrapping a cheese in a napkin for a shield and taking a mop which he had rubbed in a mud puddle, mounted the stage to meet the boasting swordsman. The fellow, of course, felt very much insulted, but the first angry thrust of his sword was skillfully caught and held fast in the soft cheese, while the dirty mop was wiped across his red face. This was repeated several times amidst roars of laughter from the bystanders. The man then lost his temper and, picking up his heavy broadsword, threatened to kill the judge. But he was warned off with such a stern voice that he was frightened, and declared that this farmer fighter must be either Whaley, Goff, or the devil. It was not long before news was brought to Boston that the regicides were wanted in England. Governor Endicott and the other magistrates debated what they ought to do. Some of them were afraid if they did not arrest the judges and send them back to England, that the new king would be angry and perhaps take away their charter. But while they were talking about it, Whaley and Goff settled the question for them by running away. Leaving Massachusetts, the two fugitive judges went to Hartford. Although they were well treated there, they decided to go on to New Haven, where they had friends. Besides, they would be nearer Manhattan should they find it necessary to leave the English colonies altogether. They arrived at New Haven in March 1661. Mr. Davenport and their other friends at Quinnipiac gave them a hearty welcome and generously cared for them. They did not try to hide for the first few weeks, but mingled with the people and went to church. Saturdays they watched the trained band practice and probably took part in the drill, showing the soldiers how to handle their guns and swords, for they were old fighters themselves. Unfortunately for the two hunted judges, their feelings of security did not last very long. They could not get out of reach of the long arm of the revengeful king, even in the wilderness of New England. One day in the latter part of March, a royal proclamation was brought to New Haven. This proclamation ordered a search to be made for the regicides in all the New England colonies. If found, they must be arrested and sent to England. The people of New Haven had been expecting this royal command for some time, and had been wondering what they should do when it came. They wanted to obey the king, but they also wanted to save the good and brave judges from a cruel death. Their good minister, Mr. Davenport, settled the question for them. He preached a sermon from a verse in the Bible which says, "Hide the outcasts, bewray not him that wandereth." That was God's command, and they decided to obey God rather than their king. So when the proclamation came, they hid the outcasts and did not betray the wandering judges. Dressed as though for a long journey, Whaley and Goff appeared on the streets of New Haven one morning and then went off in the direction of Milford. People who did not know their plans supposed, of course, that they were going to Manhattan. But during the night, they came back very quietly and hid in Mr. Davenport's house. A month later, they went across the street and stayed with Mr. Jones, whose father was also a regicide. There they remained until the king's officers came in May, when they escaped to the woods north of the town. To understand how these royal officers happened to come to New Haven, we must go back to Massachusetts for a moment. After it became known that the Regicides had left Cambridge and gone to Connecticut, the authorities in Massachusetts ordered a search made for them in their colony. There was no reason, of course, why they should not make it a thorough one. Then, to show the king how eager his colony was to obey his commands and thus gain his favor, Governor Endicott appointed 2 young men as officers to visit the other New England colonies and see if they couldn't discover and capture the colonels, as the runaway judges were called. These 2 young officers were named Thomas Kelland and Thomas Kirk. They had just arrived from England and were friends of the king. Of course, Governor Endicott could not give them power to search houses in the other colonies. He could merely ask the other governors to grant the officers that right and urge them to help in the search. Kelland and Kirk started right off to Hartford looking for Whaley and Goff. They found Governor Winthrop very polite and quite willing to give them assistance, but they soon found out that the men they wanted had gone to New Haven. So without further delay, the eager young officers hurried on southward. They reached Guilford, 15 miles from New Haven, Saturday. There they stopped to see Mr. Leete, who at that time was governor of the New Haven colony. Now, if Governor Leete had been as eager to give them aid as they were anxious to receive it, the 2 royal officers might have reached New Haven that night and spoiled all the rest of this story, but the governor was rather slow in his way of doing things, and on this particular Saturday he was very slow. At least Mr. Kelland and Mr. Kirk thought so. He began to read their letters out loud so that everybody in the room where they were could hear him and learn who the strangers were and know their errand. They interrupted his reading, warned him not to tell such important news to others, and asked to go into another room by themselves. They said afterwards that an Indian runner was immediately sent to New Haven by those who had listened to warn Whaley and Goff. Perhaps Mr. Leete didn't have his spectacles on that day. At any rate, it took him a very long time to read those letters from the governor of Massachusetts, and when he had finished them, he told the officers that he hadn't seen the colonels in 9 weeks, and he thought they must have left New Haven. But they replied that the Regicides had been seen there since that time, and asked for horses to carry them farther on their errand. The request was finally granted, but it was a very long time before the horses were ready. To the impatient young officers, it seemed as though no one in Guilford was in a hurry that afternoon. While they were waiting for their horses, someone outside told them that Whaley and Goff were hiding at Mr. Davenport's house, and that Mr. Leete knew it. So they went right back to the governor and demanded military aid. This Mr. Leete refused to grant them without the consent of the other magistrates, but he offered to give them a letter to Mr. Gilbert, who could help them. Of course, they were very glad to have such a letter, and waited for the governor to write it. It took Mr. Leete a long time to find just the right kind of paper for such an important matter, and then he had to stop to sharpen his old quill pen. By the time the letter was written, it was too late in the day for the officers to go on, and as it was Saturday night, they had to remain in Guilford over Sunday. Although Kelland and Kirk left Guilford bright and early Monday morning, a man named John Meigs started earlier and reached New Haven in time to warn the people of their coming. After the officers arrived, they had to wait several hours for Mr. Leete to come before a meeting of the magistrates could be held. They then demanded permission to search the town, but the governor told them he would not make them magistrates. They warned him not to disobey the king and get the New Haven colony into trouble. But Mr. Leete still refused their request and went to talk it over with the magistrates again. The whole day was spent in this way, and the king's officers could get no aid or satisfaction. The magistrates finally decided to call a meeting of the General Court for the next Friday to see what could be done. Kelland and Kirk were not willing to wait, however, and remained in the town only long enough to offer great rewards to any Indian or white man who would capture the Regicides, and then went on to Manhattan to continue their search in that Dutch colony. They could find no trace of either Whaley or Goff, however, and returned to Boston by boat, disgusted with their poor luck and greatly vexed at the people of New Haven. Now let us see what had become of the 2 Regicides whom we left at Mr. Jones's house. As soon as they learned from the Indian runner, who arrived from Guilford that Saturday night, that royal officers were on their way to arrest them, Whaley and Goff fled from their hiding place and took refuge in an old mill north of the town. They remained there over Sunday. On Monday, while the magistrates were debating what to do, and the officers were impatiently waiting their decision, Mr. Jones and 2 other friends guided the fugitives to another hiding place beyond West Rock, near Woodbridge. This spot they called Hatchet Harbor because there they found a hatchet with which they built a hut of green boughs. They stayed there 2 nights, and a Mr. Sperry, who lived not far away, gave them food. Then they went to the top of Providence Hill, or what is now West Rock, and hid in that strange pile of huge rocks which has long borne the name of Judge's Cave. They remained at this cave for a month, spending rainy nights at Mr. Sperry's house. This friend kept them supplied with food, sometimes carrying it to them himself, sometimes sending his little boy to leave it on a stump where they could find it. This boy used to wonder what became of the food, but his father told him there was somebody in the woods at work who wanted it. While the Regicides were hiding in this cave, the General Court of the New Haven colony met and voted to have a thorough search made in every town in the colony. Men were appointed to look through all houses, barns, and sheds. Even ships in the harbor were searched, but no trace of the judges could be found. In those early days, there were many wild beasts in the forests about New Haven that are rarely seen in the New England woods nowadays. One night, as the Regicides lay in their bed of leaves, a panther stuck his head into the mouth of the cave and gave a terrible roar. This so frightened them that soon after they left the cave and went to some unknown hiding place. One Saturday, about a week after their adventure with the panther, hearing that their friends might suffer for their kindness in hiding them, Whaley and Goff went back to New Haven and told Mr. Gilbert that they would surrender rather than cause harm to their friends. Mr. Gilbert wanted to talk with the other magistrates about it first, and as the next day was Sunday, he waited until Monday before deciding what to do. Meantime, the judges were urged by their friends to flee, so on Monday they again disappeared. Several stories are told of narrow escapes they had at that time. They were staying at the house of a Mrs. Ayers when some men started out to search for them. Mrs. Ayers saw these men coming and told Whaley and Goff to run out the back door and then come right in again. They did so, and when the officers came, the woman told them that the judges had been there, but had just gone out of the back door. So the men hurried off to the woods back of her house to find them. Then it is said that the 2 fugitives started in the direction of Mill River, or out what is now called State Street. Before they had gone very far, the town marshal caught up with and tried to arrest them. They fought so fiercely with their walking sticks, however, that the officer had to leave them and go back for aid. While he was gone, they hid under what was called Neck Bridge near Cedar Hill, and when the marshal came back with his aides, they hurried right across this bridge, not thinking that the men they were after lay under their feet. When the officers had got out of sight, Whaley and Goff slipped into the woods again and went back to their old hiding place in the cave at West Rock. It is also related that about this same time, they went over to Guilford and offered to surrender to Governor Leete, but they were hidden in his cellar and fed from his table. The New Haven officers soon gave up the search for the brave colonels and made no further effort to arrest them. In August, the judges again left the cave and went to Milford, where they lived hidden with a Mr. Tompkins for several years. For 2 years they did not even go out of the house, and their presence was known to only 2 or 3 persons in town. In 1664, a new danger arose. 4 royal commissioners arrived at Boston to seek the Regicides and arrest them. So Whaley and Goff left Milford and returned to their old home in the cave at West Rock. But an Indian discovered the hiding place one day and reported it in New Haven. Then it was decided that they must find some new shelter farther away from the colonies, and after a long journey through the forests, they found a home with Reverend Mr. Russell at Hadley in the western part of Massachusetts. They remained in safety there until they died some years later. Sometime after Whaley and Goff had gone to Hadley, a stranger giving the name of James Davids came to New Haven to live. He was a very quiet but wise-looking man. Very few knew anything of his history or that his real name was John Dixwell, one of the Regicides. Where he had hidden during the years since Charles II became king, no one knows. He went to live in the house of Mr. Ling on the corner of College and Grove Streets. Reverend Mr. Pierpont, who was minister in New Haven at that time, knew him better than anyone else, and as they were near neighbors, they often met at the fence which divided their yards and had long talks together. We can guess that Mr. Dixwell told the good minister many stories of the old days in England when a king lost his head. Mr. Pierpont's wife used to wonder why her husband talked so much with that strange old man, but he merely replied to her questioning, "He is a very knowing and learned man." In 1686, that tyrannical old governor of New England, Sir Edmund Andros, spent a Sunday in New Haven and saw Mr. Dixwell at church. He asked someone who that noble-looking man was, and was told that he was a merchant. "I know that he is not a merchant," said the governor. Someone must have told Mr. Dixwell of it, for he was not at church in the afternoon. James Davids later married the widow of Mr. Ling and remained in New Haven until his death. He lies buried in the rear of the Old Center Church on the green, but the monument over his grave bears the name of John Dixwell.
If you enjoy the content of High Americana, please consider supporting the channel, donating to Patreon linked below. Thank you very much.